You're listening to the Ottoman History Podcast. To find out more about today's topic or to check out some of our other episodes, along with maps, images, documents, and other materials related to the history of the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East, visit us on the web at ottomanhistorypodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to another installment of the Ottoman History Podcast. I'm Chris Grayton.
And I'm Nick Danforth.
And today we're speaking with Scott Rank, a PhD candidate at Central European University in Budapest, focusing on religious, cultural, and social history of the Ottoman Empire. Today, Scott will be discussing American Protestant missionary activities in the Ottoman Empire. Scott, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
So when did American Protestant missionaries first come to the Ottoman Empire, and why did they come to the Ottoman Empire?
The organization that I'm going to spend my time talking about were the American Board of the Commissioners for Foreign Missions. We'll just refer to them as the board.
Or the ABCFM.
And they launched in the early 19th century as part of the Second Great Awakening. And within a few decades, we're sending missionaries all over the world to Africa and China and the Ottoman Empire, which they arrived in 1820. Their vision was to obviously convert Muslims there and Christians of the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches to Protestant Christianity. And their vision of doing so was rooted in a postmillennialist eschatology, meaning that they had an idea that before the second coming of Christ, there would be a growth of the church over the world, concomitant with progress, the growth of knowledge, the reduction of poverty. And their vision of enacting this agenda was strongly through building schools. So it's difficult to overstress how central schools were to their mission. Because of this, they play a very large role, particularly in the later Ottoman Empire, in terms of education reform, and when the Ottoman state was trying to expand and consolidate its own network of primary and secondary schools, finding that in many localities they were competing with the missionary schools.
And these schools were doing more than just religious education, isn't that right? They were providing general education and other subjects as well?
Right. I think one thing that made their organization last so long, and it existed in a large presence from the 1820s until really the end of the Ottoman Empire, was because of the success of their schools, which didn't just offer religious lessons, but a full Enlightenment education of a full science curriculum, language, which was very popular, particularly those that wanted to be traders or be involved in some kind of industry that required a Western language.
So how did the Ottoman state feel about the board operating in its borders? What facilitated, it seems that the Ottoman state would have been hostile to the coming of foreign missionaries, but were they welcomed? What was the reception?
To answer that, I'll just give a really brief sketch of what their mission looked like because it lasted for about 4 generations and it had a different relationship with the state over time. Very roughly, in the opening decades of their operation, when they set up stations in Lebanon and in the 1820s and then Constantinople in the 1830s, the biggest hostility and negative reactions they had weren't from the Ottoman state, but from the Maronite and Armenian patriarchs. They issued anathemas against those in their congregation who would have relations with the Protestants and threatened to excommunicate those who were too closely aligned with them. This is something that Usama Makdisi mentions a lot in his book, Artillery of Heaven, about the first Maronite convert to Protestantism, Asad Shidyak. It's really not until about the 1860s when the American board heavily expands its operation and sets up stations in the central and eastern parts of Anatolia. And as its operation expands, and particularly in the Hamidian period, when Abdul Hamid is attempting to consolidate and uniformize its administration and education network, this is when you see this clash, as it were, of the American board operation and the state. So the difficulties and the negative reactions existed in a low simmering degree when the American board came, but the tensions really start to rise in the latter part of the 19th century.
Now, you mentioned Usama Makdisi's Artillery of Heaven. If I remember the argument of that book correctly, one of the things he says is that was really the inability of these missionaries to actually get converts that prompted them to focus so much on education. Is that a fair assessment, or do you think education was part of their mission, independent of...
Usama Makdisi does a good job of showing the struggles that the missionaries did have with dealing with modernity and how that affected their mission. Something that he's pointed out is that they wanted to appropriate specific parts of modernity, like a secular education and bringing in printing presses to promulgate Bibles and religious pamphlets and the like. At the same time, trying not to wholesale incorporate all parts of what we understand to be modernity, particularly its secular aspects, because they thought that could undermine their mission. What he points out is that in certain parts, particularly what he examines, Mount Lebanon, there were very, very few converts to Protestantism. For the most part, the mission operation wasn't successful. So even after 1860, at the Syrian Protestant College, the effort isn't so much on conversion to Protestantism, but enhancing the education and what they thought to be the condition of the people with which they interacted. However, I've looked at other parts of the empire, and I looked a lot at the missionary station in Marzaphone, which is today in western Anatolia. And there was a fair degree success in that missionary station and others in Anatolia of producing converts to Protestantism. Now, it should be noted that there were very, very few converts from Islam to Christianity. There were a couple, but they were always a very marginal number. It was mostly converts from Eastern Orthodox Christianity or the Armenian Apostolic Church. I should point out here that early on, when the American board saw that they wouldn't have a lot of success in converting Muslims to Christianity, they formed a strategy, what some have called the Great Experiment, which meant that they thought they would, rather than try to directly convert Muslims to Christianity, they would convert those of the ancient churches to Protestant Christianity, and then those converts would in turn go out and then try to convert Muslims to Christianity. The second stage really never happened. The first stage didn't succeed in some areas like Mount Lebanon and succeeded in differing degrees in other areas like Marzaphone, what I've looked at.
It did create this small class of people who not only converted to Protestant Christianity, but also developed stronger ties to the Western entities inside the Ottoman Empire. And I think this leads into our next question about the role of missionaries in imperialism and colonialism, or their connection or lack of connection to that. A very stereotyped view of missionaries is that they are either a destabilizing force or that they are just another aspect of colonialism, sort of either a vanguard of colonialism or, furthering the colonial agenda. To what extent, like with a more closer look at the missionary activities and sources, is that characterization true, or how is it false?
This is something that is largely present in the historiography of the American Board, particularly in the Turkish historiography. Unfortunately, a lot of these books, they only focus on things that are found in the Ottoman archives, and those are typically reports of the Ottoman state following the ways that American missionaries are besmirching the Ottoman government in the Western press. So if this is the only source you look at, then yes, the American missionaries do look like a destabilizing force. I haven't found a lot of books in Turkish historiography that use the American sources. There is one book whose name I forget, but it's by Uğur Kocabasoglu, which is a very good monograph. But in terms of colonialism, their relationship is quite different, I would say, than Anglican missionaries in India during British colonialism, because America, their role as a colonial state in the 19th century is a very debatable subject, but they didn't have quite the same colonial mindset, particularly how their works were seen in the Ottoman Empire, until about after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And the American Board, in many ways, had worse relationship with American diplomats than they did with British diplomats, because in many ways the American diplomatic corps felt that their work was being belied by these missionaries that were saying negative things about the Ottoman state in the foreign press. I think that it's a little bit too simplistic to just see them as a destabilizing force. there were many missionaries who talked in their own private correspondence very negatively of Sultan Abdul Hamid, some of them secretly wishing that the British or other colonial powers would come in and take over the empire, and then their missionary enterprise would work much better.
So you indicated that this story of the missionaries as this destabilizing force is maybe not complete or a complex presentation. Now, in James Field's book about American imperial presence in the Mediterranean, he talks about how because the missionaries preceded any sort of even diplomatic presence in the Ottoman Empire, their presence in these places could be seen as sort of a way of projecting American imperial power. That through merchants and missionaries, America became involved for various reasons in not only diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, but also protecting the interests of its foreign citizens abroad. The idea of the citizen as obviously the property of the state in some regard, but also the responsibility of the state.
So you're saying the missionaries really drew the American government into the
Well, the
Ottoman
missionaries,
Empire.
along with the merchants who were coming in at this time, what do you say about this? I mean, obviously it's complex because in some cases the American diplomatic corps, as you said, was quite hostile towards the missionaries, didn't like they were getting themselves into trouble. But what do you think about this?
It's really interesting to see what their role was vis-a-vis the diplomatic corps, and how some missionaries even had contacts back with Washington to a degree that it's almost unimaginable today. I found a few letters in the ABCFM archives that I looked in where when some of the heads of the Merziphone missionary station were working through a difficult situation where in 1894 one of their schools was burned down, and they believed that the state security forces, the Zaptieh, had essentially done it but blamed it on Armenian revolutionaries. And they felt that the American diplomatic corps wasn't doing their job in getting an indemnity paid. So I found letters that were written by these missionaries to Grover Cleveland to try to engineer the firing of the chief diplomat of the United States and replace him with somebody who would work for their interests. And in the 1893 State of the Union, or 1894, Grover Cleveland mentions the burning of the Merziphone station. So that they could have such high-level contacts and even be working with people in Washington. And in some ways, subverting the powers of these diplomats. It's interesting to see that how they're, in their mind, they think that they are doing a better job of fighting for the political interests of America than the diplomatic corps are doing themselves, because they feel that the interests of their missionary network and the interests of America are in many ways one and the same, which obviously many of the diplomats disagreed with. So there's a very interesting tension that's going on there.
So if we could take a step back for a moment, you said that the number of converts actually secured by these missionaries was relatively low, but was there a larger impact on culture and society in the Ottoman Empire?
It's interesting to see what impacts they did have, because the number of American missionaries in the empire at any time was rather low, only about 100 to 200. And I think the highest numbers they reached in 1914 were about 465 schools and about 30 to 40,000 people that were officially registered as Protestants, and then somewhere around similar numbers of people who were attending their schools. Now, for four generations of work, this would seem like low numbers. But some of the ways that their impact can be seen, in addition to education reform, and this is very important because Selçuk Somel has a good monograph about education reform in the 19th century, and he mentions that much of the influence about where to place Rushdie schools and how to reform was influenced by missionaries. And Hans Lucas Kaiser has a book that was written in German. I think he only has a translation in Turkish, İskanlamış Barış, and he mentions that much of healthcare reform in the Ottoman Empire was influenced by the hospitals that were constructed by the American. But one point I want to stress is that when I was reading the Missionary Herald, which was the newspaper written by American missionaries, they're always telling these, I think, embellished stories of people converting to Protestantism, partly because, of course, that's how they secured funds and fundraising. But another thing that I saw pop up quite a bit in the Herald that really confused me when I first saw it is they would talk about how there was what they would call a revival taking place in these historical churches without these people converting to Protestantism. So they would see cases of priests within the Apostolic Armenian Church, rather than using liturgical Armenian, preaching in vernacular Armenian and using a homiletical style that was similar to the American missionaries. Why would they be talking about this? Because their goal wasn't to influence the historical churches. What was the effect of this? Why would there be a cross-pollination taking place between Protestant Christians and Christians within the historical churches? And something that helped explain this phenomenon a little bit is I found a monograph by an Armenian Protestant named Haratun Jananian, who was educated at Union Theological Seminary in New York and started the Tarsus American College that still exists in Turkey today. And something that he stressed was that in many ways he was something of an Armenian nationalist, and his idea of increasing religiosity among Armenians and other Christians wasn't so much a mass conversion to Protestantism, but that all stripes of confessions, whether Catholic, Orthodox, Apostolic Armenian, Protestant, was that they would increasingly educate themselves and have a more enlightened understanding of their faith. His idea of the division between the religious and the unreligious wasn't so much between Protestant and non-Protestant, but between those who were educated and those who were uneducated. And I found an excerpt from an Armenian newspaper named Arvalik, where the author, I don't know who wrote it, but I assume he'd be Apostolic Armenian, he said the same thing. He's writing during the Hamidian period, and he said that he had a lot of positive things to say about Protestant Christians, and he thinks that the divides now in the late 19th century isn't between different confessional groups, between the educated and the uneducated. And he felt what was holding back the Armenians were priests who, other than a smattering of liturgical Armenian, weren't much more educated than typical peasants. So he thought that the answer to this issue was education. So I say all this to say that education may have been the meeting ground where you see this cross-pollination happening between Protestants and other confessional groups within Christianity. Now, all that to say, one last thing I want to say with this is I don't want to overstress the positive relationships. I mean, from the beginning of the American board presence in the Ottoman Empire to the very end, there was enmity and acrimony and hostility, particularly at the patriarch level and the bishop level. Anathemas were still being issued. There were still tensions among the ecclesial class against the Protestants. So I don't want to say that everything was wonderful, but I just want to say that the relationship was a little bit more complicated than some would let on.
Would it be fair to say then that in much the same way the Ottoman Empire and later modern Turkey adopted certain aspects of what they thought of as Western civilization, Western modernity, precisely in order to prevent the military takeover or colonization by the West? Some of these historic Christian churches tried to adopt certain elements of Protestantism to prevent Protestant missionaries from converting their flock, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate to say that if you were an Armenian priest in the city of Merziphone, for example, and you saw a lot of people in your flock becoming Protestants because they were all going to this American board school, then you would probably be very concerned about that and want to counteract that. Now, another interesting fact with this is that one of the biggest nemesi, however you would say that the American board thought that they saw were Catholic Jesuits who opened up French Jesuit schools. They were really threatened by this, not because of theological issues, but they saw that other people whom they were trying to bring to their schools and hoped that this would facilitate their conversion to Protestantism were going to French Jesuit schools and becoming Catholic. So it's this tug of war with these different schools, and because of this, I think this is something that with rising levels of education that was taking place in the late 19th century, particularly among Armenians, something that American born missionaries felt threatened by is they realized that there's a lot of people that aren't converting to Protestantism as much as they would have a few decades ago because they have educational opportunities within their own confessional group. So there's not as much of a need to become Protestant. And they were glad to see that they saw this so-called Protestantization that was happening within these historical confessional groups. But I think they would have preferred they had become Protestant and they weren't. So this, I think, was a little bit vexing for a lot of these missionaries.
How do the missionaries and their converts or people educated in their schools fit in with the encounter between Christian and Muslim intellectuals during the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire? Were similar cross-pollinations and debates going on there as well?
Yeah, I would say definitely, albeit in a much more acrimonious way. Now, this is a very, very big question, I think a very important one, and I haven't seen a lot of research on it. Some research that I'm doing right now are religious polemics in the late 19th century. To answer your question, ways that we can see similar effects going on, the religious polemics that I've seen written by Muslim intellectuals have been heavily influenced by German biblical textual criticism and German higher biblical criticism. So they'll take European theological arguments to criticize the internal consistency of the Bible, and Muslim intellectuals will use these arguments to argue against Protestant Christianity and Christianity in general. In the same way, Protestant missionaries who wrote polemics and religious tracts against Islam had a post-millennial viewpoint where they were arguing in the name of the Enlightenment and progress that Islam was also not internally coherent. So both sides are arguing in the name of reason and internal coherency, and this idea of looking at religious work as a text and deconstructing it. And they're both using, in similar ways, these tools of modernism to argue against each other. So this could, in some ways, be seen as a cross-pollination. It's a much more negative, acrimonious cross-pollination, but still one nonetheless.
Well, Scott, I think the missionaries in their time really were at the crux of many different things that were going on between East and West, the Ottoman Empire, and European and America, and I think that their story really adds something to our understanding of Ottoman history.
Yeah. And one last thing I wanted to mention is that you don't have to be interested only in missionaries per se to use their documentation as sources, because within the Houghton Library in Harvard, the ABCFM archive has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of letters, station reports, and their stations, particularly after 1860, were in central and eastern Anatolia, all across the empire. If you're interested in groups like Alevis or Kurds that the ABCFM had a lot of contact with, it's a fantastic source, particularly when there's not a lot of state documentation at this time. So I would recommend using them as a source, and it's in English, which is great.
Well, Scott, thanks for coming on and talking about the ABCFM and the Ottoman Empire with us today.
Thank you.
For those who are interested in finding out more about this topic, there will be a bibliography in the blog post where you can also post your comments and questions. Thank you for listening to the Ottoman History Podcast, and until next time, take care.